The continent of Africa has some of the most fascinating political history in the world. It stands as a vast and continuous experiment of often the worst ideologies that one can imagine from both extremes of the political spectrum. With some of the poorest countries on the planet, Africa has received more foreign aid than any other continent. This might not seem like news to you. Africa has always been this way, right? We know what caused the issues there. It's the debt to the International Monetary Fund, or decades of colonization, or capitalism. Wait, capitalism? Did I read that right? Yeah, that says capitalism. Basically, it's everybody else's fault. This is true to a point. I mean, it's not like foreign aid is doing Africa any favors. Tanzania, or Tanganyika as it was called before merging with the island of Zanzibar off the coast, is a great case study for this. It's a poster child for many of Africa's issues, with Tanzania receiving huge amounts of foreign aid, having a debt to the IMF, and a history of about 80 years of colonialism. Interestingly, the only thing they're missing, it seems, is capitalism. Which of course you can learn all about because you can read books from Amazon to learn about anything you're interested in. Sometimes I have trouble finding books for inspiration, and that's why it's great to have a full library to choose from at Amazon. You can browse through thousands of awesome books on economic history and much more. Learn from great authors about how the world works and all those interesting topics you've been wanting to do a deep dive on. Depending on your preferences, you can pick between Kindle, paperback, hardcover, and Audible. There's a lot of great deals up right now, so scroll down, click the link below, and check out all the great options available. Anyways, let's take a look at how Tanzania chose chaos and ruined its economy in less than 10 years. Before Tanganyika was granted independence, it was colonized by Germany for about 35 years between 1885 and 1919. Then Germany transferred control to the UK through the Treaty of Versailles after it lost in World War I. 30 years later, after World War II, in the 1950s and 60s, there was a general shift in acceptance to colonial rule all over Africa, and Tanganyika was no different. The groups that were most in favor of independence were mostly the exporting, importing, and large company-owning capitalists that were held back by the colonialist system, along with the more general workers like small business owners, skilled workers, teachers, and civil servants, and eventually these classes negotiated independence on December 9, 1961. However, the Tanganyika African National Union, or TANU, and their followers in the rural 96% of the country won control over Tanganyika. After independence, the founder of the TANU party, Prime Minister Julius Nyerere, resigned and wrote the essay Ujamaa, the basis for African socialism. It put forth an idea of social values and interaction based on the idea of the extended family, where the individual worked for the community and in return the community took care of them. Basically, the rural African Socialist Manifesto, full of wishful thinking and prescribed ethics to create a state of monetary, social, and political equity for an economic system like Tanzania's, prioritizing agricultural development and Ujamaa villages rather than industrial development. So how did Tanzania start this journey into socialism? Well, it's Africa. Let's take a wild guess. Foreign aid from capitalist countries? Yes, as per usual, including from the United States, once again supporting a burgeoning, economically controlled socialist system. Cue the 5-year plans. Starting in 1961, the first 3-year and 5-year plans were heavily subsidized by foreign aid and loans, and they were still not getting enough to achieve their goals, with some of their targets for their 5-year plan turning out to have no growth or negative growth. It didn't help that in 1964, West Germany found out that Tanzania was providing consulate status to East Germany, the Soviet-controlled part, of course. And because of the political situation at the time, West Germany ended up pulling out all of their foreign aid to Tanzania. In 1965, this happened again, when Tanzania and 8 other African states cut diplomatic ties with Britain because Britain didn't take down the white supremacist regime in Rhodesia, as they said they would before December 15th of that year. These reductions in foreign aid did not deter their goal to create a socialist state, though. They stuck to their principles, I'll give them that. The union of Tanganyika and the island of Zanzibar off the east coast of Africa in 1964 also further radicalized the government of the newly minted Tanzania, with the heavy influence of Marxist-Leninist thought from the political leadership in Zanzibar diffusing into the higher levels of government. However, Tanzania stuck mostly to the special socialist ideas of Ujamaa and the TANU party, oddly working against much of the traditional ideas of Marxism. such as Marx's idea of a communist or socialist government forming out of a previously industrialized capitalist country or colony revolting, or the Leninist ideas of heavy and fast urbanization and industrialization to become better and more competitive against capitalist countries. Tanzania became an authoritarian, one-party, collectivist socialist state. There is no doubt about that, but it is by no means a faithful representation of Marxism or Leninism. Tanzania's direction could almost be considered a cult of poverty, heavily influenced by socialism and focusing mostly on reducing the accumulation of wealth, industrialization, and urbanization. Basically, focus on creating more poor peasant farmers, and ignore what makes money, because that's what capitalist pigs do. Actually, within the Tanzanian constitution, it directly says it will intervene to generally control the economy of the country and actively prevent the accumulation of wealth. This is socialism, and it's also really stupid. It's truly no wonder why everything fell apart so quickly. Julius Nyerere also didn't hide his disdain for people with Western education and their pompous, bourgeois attitudes. People like himself, actually, as he got his education from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, where he learned about socialism. But I guess it doesn't apply to him, because he's a socialist. He considered it a duty for him and the people of his country to stop Tanzanians from getting Western-style education and treat those educated people who act quote-unquote pompous with scorn. Keep that word in mind. Scorn. All the way back in 1962, in the beginning of Tanganyikan independence, he was worried about class distinctions caused by education and wealth in his country, saying,
"As nationalism becomes successful, the chances of the Europeans and the Asians maintaining a permanently privileged position in our countries will tend to diminish. But the chances of the educated Africans to become a new privileged class will multiply. The would-be African exploiter can masquerade as a great social reformer by concentrating the attack on European and Asian privilege. Before we know where we are, what is now an essentially dying-out privileged class will have been replaced by a permanently privileged class of educated Africans."
In October 1966, it would become obvious what Nyerere meant by scorn, and he turned his dislike of educated people into political action, actively punishing those who went to school within his country by creating the compulsory national service for all college graduate students, requiring all educated young people to do a mandatory 3-year sentence of hard labor with a minimal salary to help participate in building the country. The TANU Party also required white-collar workers in urban areas to cultivate land in their spare time. You might think that this would be a terrible idea. Why would you send a professional who's qualified to do specialized work that requires specialized knowledge to work on a farm and dig ditches for a subsistence salary? But this is where you miss the point. Efficiency and prosperity are not the purpose of these policies. The purpose was to make an example of those who embodied the colonial system before independence, and to attempt to create a cultural socialism that devalued Western education. Yeah, there's no way this could backfire. Nyerere believed that this forced hard labor in rural areas of Tanzania would create a more communal mindset for the younger people of the country by showing them the real lives of most Tanzanians that he believed they had forgotten about while sitting in their comfy schools and their employment thereafter. The students at the University College of Dar es Salaam were the first to be forced into national service, and naturally, they protested the new system. They did not like the idea of a salary cut, obviously, especially when there were educated, highly paid government officials that were forcing them to do the work. Nyerere responded by lowering everyone's government salaries by 15% and even his own by 20%. It's not like this would ever lead to an increase in corruption or anything, and I mean, who needs money when you have power, right? Later, Nyerere would also completely change the entire education system to fit the goals of the socialist system he was attempting to create, one that emphasized an agricultural and rural society. Implementing the compulsory national service was followed by the Arusha Declaration on February 13, 1967, which codified the Ujamaa ideology into the 5-year plans in Tanzania. The declaration contained anti-exploitation rhetoric that asserted that Tanzania had been oppressed and that they wanted a revolution that brought an end to their weakness, quote-unquote, so that we are never again exploited, oppressed, or humiliated. Consequently, the government nationalized most of the means of production owned by foreigners with the goal of ending exploitation by outside forces. And they wondered why they weren't getting any investment. This is why. Business people don't like it when you steal their stuff. The declaration attempted to instill socialism in Tanzania by promoting Ujamaa ideology, which included the characteristics of self-reliance, rural development, and community. They pushed self-reliance specifically because the government would not be able to provide much assistance, as money would be scarce as a result of their incredibly overburdened governmental system, the incredibly low income of people to feed taxes into the system, and less economic aid than they were hoping for. They even decided to use different indicators to measure progress rather than money, because they knew that the country wouldn't be making any. They aren't even trying, really. They're just like, have fun with less freedom and money. This is what you need. Not to be prosperous, but to be socialist. Well, at least they kind of admitted it. Instead of money as an indicator of success, they used labor and the resources already abundant within the country. This and the Arusha Declaration stating that Tanzania's priority would be villagization, or the creation of Ujamaa villages and rural development, stratified Tanzania as a rural economy. The Ujamaa villages were designed as a voluntary way to take Tanzania from a poor society to a modern and productive one without all of the disruption that normally came with social change, and they took precedence over all else in the government. Eventually, with consistent government intervention, the country became increasingly corrupted with its inefficiencies. With its increasing inability to effectively plan the economy, the Ujamaa villages were more or less on their own. The villages became increasingly bureaucratic and corrupt, and without any official hierarchy, they naturally created their own social hierarchies, with governing people accumulating more wealth than others. With the Ujamaa villages becoming a national priority, and many candidates for government office being asked to demonstrate what they have accomplished to further the Ujamaa villagization policies, local leaders in the urban areas, like the city of Kilimanjaro, where villagization had been resisted for years, felt the need to invest in Ujamaa villages, even where the land was not usable for sustaining them, just to show their dedication to the cause and receive social services and credit set aside for the Ujamaa villages. Government officials and bureaucrats used the Ujamaa policy to get more government money and incrementally exploit the majority of Tanzanians, with the gap between the rich and the poor rising more than before Ujamaa was implemented. A lot of people in the country did not want to live in these villages because they would make more money working in the cities and they didn't have to do as much hard labor, but Nyerere didn't like that at all. It sounded too much like capitalism to him. Eventually, when he realized that not everybody was down with Ujamaa villagization, Nyerere became more oppressive. In 1973, he stated, "To live in villages is an order," and the government began to force people to move into these collective villages over the next 3 years. The officials spearheading villagization were often in competition with each other for who could do it the fastest, leading to some serious issues. If people did not want to go, the military would often destroy their homes so they wouldn't try to move back, imprison them, and sometimes they were killed. When they were relocated, they were often dropped off with their belongings and told to build their own homes. Agricultural economist Phil Rakes, who spent 8 years in Tanzania, writes in Ujamaa and Rural Socialism that
the coercion of the mid-1970s took forms and reached levels which would be considered an outrageous intrusion into the rights of the individual in most Western countries.
This led to a massive expansion in villages, making it seem as if the system was incredibly successful from the outside, with over 2,500 villages in the 1970s. While there were only a few functioning villages that were actually devoted to cooperation and the Ujamaa ideology. The idea of living and working together in these villages as peaceful cooperatives withered away as people were unwilling to live together, and the government instead often emphasized the idea of quote-unquote development or planned villages, only superficially called Ujamaa. Researcher and teacher Andrew Coulson, who studied Tanzania in the 1970s, writes in Tanzania, A Political Economy,
"The way in which villages were created hardly encouraged grassroots participation because there were such obvious shows of government force and so little time for discussion or real planning."
These villages were placed where they were easiest to control by the government, like by a main road, for example, with little attention paid to how far away they were from the fields or the effect on agriculture. As soil exhaustion increased rapidly, animal and human populations grew past the sustainability of the land, and shifting cultivation became impossible in many areas. These farmers were essentially nationalized, so they were forced to sell all of their produce through the government, crippling their ability to adapt to the economy. Government controls kept prices lower for consumers, and high taxes made the profits even lower. For example, cashew farmers were only receiving about 30% of the world market price. These high taxes were supposed to be used to develop the country, but it was hardly ever done, because most of it was used for government salaries. Financially squeezing the producers incentivized them to reduce production and created a thriving black market for those willing to sell outside the official channels. As a result of all of these policies, the agricultural production suffered, eventually leading to a 50% drop in production from what was possible on privately owned farms before. And while Tanzania had one of the highest minimum wages in Africa, as a result, it also had incredibly high unemployment and a sky-high inflation of about 35%. By 1976, most of the rural population of Tanzania had been forcibly moved to Ujama villages, with the government claiming that it moved around 13 million people. Ironically, people's dislike of the Ujama villagization actually led Tanzania to urbanize faster than nearly anywhere else in the world during the 1970s, which was exactly the opposite of what they were trying to do. And as people were forcibly moved off their land, many of them decided to walk right past the Ujama villages and move into town to avoid the increasingly bureaucratically controlled villages. Overall, villagization and the intense regulations that came with socialism in Tanzania decreased people's freedom and held the country back from its much higher potential. The failure of Ujama socialism led Tanzania's government, which had previously sworn off foreign aid, to return to capitalist countries for some of the most foreign aid per capita of any country in the entire world in order to continue running its dying system. Ujama was officially brought to an end in 1985, when President Nyerere stepped down. President. Yeah, right. After 25 years? Guy's closing in on God Emperor status. Regardless, Tanzania did make some social, educational, and medical improvements during this time. At least the government reported that it did. These included reduced tribal and ethnic tensions compared to the rest of Africa, which is great, considering how huge of a problem that is in Africa, making interracial issues in the West look like puppies play fighting. They also raised literacy rates from about 17% in 1960 to about 63% in 1975. And lastly, they decreased their infant mortality rate from about 138 per 1,000 births in 1965 to 110 in 1985, which honestly is still not that great. However, these are real accomplishments, and there are a few other advancements they made in the backdrop of authoritarian socialism. The problem with the Ujama structure in particular, and socialism in general, is the blatant disregard for human freedom, treating people like toys that you can mold to fit a ridiculous, unproven political ideology, taxing and regulating people to no end to further the ideals of an increasingly corrupt and hulking government, which, for some reason, is allowed unlimited power over its people to carry out harmful and often deadly economic experiments under the guise of liberating the working class and helping people, as well as the simple fact that it is unsustainable for the government to steal from its people in perpetuity and expect to run a functioning economy that way. Anyways, that's everything. Check out my sources in the description if you'd like, and feel free to help us out with a tip to our Ko-Fi. If you're a creator struggling to make content, check out Danksphere in the link in the description, a production meets marketing company that helps creators turn their stories into content that grows their audience and business. And of course, stay free.